this video, we uncover the chilling stories of the most feared black women in U.S. prison history. From former officers turned killers to mothers driven by darkness, these women shocked a nation. Their crimes defied logic, and their legacies remain burned into America's true crime timeline. Watch until the end to uncover what made them so terrifying. 1. Marilyn Kay Edge. On a quiet September weekend in 2013, hotel staff at the Hampton Inn and Suites in Santa Ana, California, made a discovery that would leave an entire community stunned. Behind the locked door of a modest third-floor room lay the bodies of two children, 13-year-old Jalen and 10-year-old Faith Edge. Their mother, 42-year-old Marilyn Kay Edge, had already vanished. Born in 1971 and raised in the southeastern United States, Marilyn Edge appeared on the surface to be a devoted mother. Described as intelligent and educated, she held a business degree and had worked as a financial analyst. But beneath that exterior was a woman unraveling, emotionally overwhelmed, legally embattled, and ultimately consumed by a custody battle that would end in unspeakable tragedy. For years, Marilyn and her ex-husband, Mark Edge, fought over custody of their two children. The divorce, finalized in 2007, set off a series of legal disputes spanning several states. Their son, Jalen, diagnosed with autism, was often at the center of Marilyn's arguments. She claimed that his condition made court-ordered visits with Mark disruptive. Yet Mark, a military veteran and contractor, insisted he only wanted to be part of his children's lives. In early September 2013, a Georgia judge sided with the father, granting him full custody after years of delays and unsubstantiated accusations. Marilyn was ordered to return the children by Sunday, September 15th, but she never did. 3 days before the deadline, Marilyn took Jalen and Faith from Arizona to California, under the pretense of a vacation. Disneyland, the beach places a child might dream of, but prosecutors later alleged this was part of her plan. On the morning of September 14th, Marilyn drove her car into an electrical box outside a Home Depot in Costa Mesa. Police arrived to find her attempting to take her own life using an electrical cord. She was rescued, placed under suicide watch, and later confessed her children were already dead back in the hotel room. According to investigators, the method was poison. Though officials withheld the exact substance, it was enough to file charges that included special circumstances murder by poison and multiple victims. If convicted, Marilyn Edge faced life in prison or the death penalty. Her first court appearance was brief but chilling. When asked if she wanted to delay her arraignment, Marilyn responded 3 times, "Only if you promise me the death penalty." In custody and undergoing psychiatric evaluation, Edge awaits trial in Orange County. Prosecutors have not ruled out seeking the death penalty, but a final decision has yet to be made. The father, Mark Edge, never saw it coming. In an emotional message posted online, he wrote, "I walk away from the evil deeds of one and carry the grief of 3. The legacy of this case is steeped not only in grief, but in haunting questions about custody disputes, mental health, and the invisible collapse of a person once seen as loving and stable." In the end, 2 young lives were lost, not to vengeance or impulse, but to a mother's irreversible decision made in silence, far from the courtroom and far from mercy. Their story is now part of a tragic record, a reminder that sometimes the most devastating crimes come not from strangers, but from those we trust the most. 2. Debra Denise Brown. In the summer of 1984, a quiet but chilling storm moved across the Midwest, leaving behind a trail of confusion, fear, and irrevocable loss. At its center was a woman many never suspected, Debra Denise Brown. Born in 1962 in Ohio, Debra Brown was one of 11 children. Her upbringing was marked by instability and trauma. She was considered developmentally delayed with documented IQ scores ranging from 59 to 74. She sustained head injuries as a child and struggled with a dependent personality which made her highly suggestible and eager to please. Until the age of 21, she had no criminal history. But everything changed when she met Alton Coleman. Coleman, a seasoned predator with a long record of sexual violence, quickly became the dominant figure in Brown's life. Their relationship was described by prosecutors as a disturbing master-slave dynamic. Together, they formed one of the most destructive criminal duos in American history. Over a span of 2 months in 1984, Brown and Coleman carried out a cross-state crime spree that would stretch across southern Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Kentucky, and Ohio. They left behind 8 murder victims, including children and elderly adults, and numerous survivors who were kidnapped, assaulted, or left for dead. The victims were almost exclusively African American, chosen prosecutors, said not for racial motive, but because the pair believed they would attract less attention in black communities. Their pattern was chilling. They earned trust through kindness and familiarity, only to betray it in brutal, calculated attacks. Often, they would stay with their victims using charm to disarm. Then, without warning, they would strike. Ligature strangulation became their signature method. Among the most haunting cases was that of 7-year-old Tamika Turks. She and her niece were approached by Brown and Coleman while walking home from a candy store. Tamika never made it back. The cruelty of that act and others like it would eventually seal Brown's fate in court. After their capture in Evanston, Illinois on July 20th, 1984, just 3 days after Coleman was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, the legal system moved swiftly. Prosecutors across multiple states coordinated efforts to ensure justice was served. In Ohio, Deborah Brown was sentenced to death for her role in 2 murders, but in 1991 her death sentence was commuted by Governor Richard Celeste. He cited her cognitive impairments, her nonviolent history, before meeting Coleman, and her complete subjugation to his control. Still, she remains under a separate death sentence from the state of Indiana. Today, Debra Denise Brown is incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She has shown little remorse, once sending a note to a judge that read, "I killed the bitch, and I don't give a damn. I had fun out of it." That one line offers a glimpse into the psychology of someone whose life was perhaps twisted beyond recognition long before she met Alton Coleman, and who in turn became a willing accomplice in a saga of horror that still echoes decades later. Deborah Brown remains the only woman on Indiana's death row, and her legacy, tangled in psychological dependence and personal choice, stands as a sobering reminder of how dangerous influence left unchecked can become. 3. Tiffany Hall. In the fall of 2006, a small Illinois community was shaken by a crime so devastating it defied comprehension. At the center of it all was a 24-year-old woman named Tiffany Hall, someone known to her victims. Trusted, familiar, but behind that facade lay a tragic and dangerous unraveling. Tiffany Hall was born on March 23, 1982, and raised in East St. Louis, Illinois. She and Jamela Tunstall had grown up together attending the same alternative schools. Jamela, 23, and 7 months pregnant, often relied on Hall to babysit her 3 young children. There was no reason to suspect that her friend could become her greatest threat. On September 15, 2006, Tiffany Hall struck Jamela repeatedly and fatally in the head. Prosecutors say she then carried out a calculated act, cutting Jamela's unborn child from her womb. The young mother bled to death in a bathtub. Her body was hidden in a nearby field. Hours later, Hall appeared at a park, claiming she had just given birth to a stillborn baby. She even brought the fetus with her. The lies began to unravel quickly. Hall refused to be examined at the hospital. Her story was full of contradictions, but the full scope of what happened would take several more days to emerge. 3 days after Jamela's murder, Hall returned to the father of Jamella's children. She claimed she was there on Jamella's behalf to pick up the children and the car. Trusting her, he allowed her to leave with them. That was the last time he saw his children alive. Authorities now believe Hall returned to the same home where Jamella had died. There, in the same bathtub, she drowned the 3 children, 7-year-old Demond, 2-year-old Ivan, and 1-year-old Janella. Their bodies were later found hidden in the washer and dryer of their apartment. A week passed. Then, during a funeral for the fetus who Hall had named and buried, she confessed to her boyfriend that the baby wasn't his, that she had taken it, that she had killed a woman. The boyfriend contacted police immediately. Hall was arrested the same day. What followed was a wave of disbelief and sorrow. At her hearings, investigators described her as cooperative but emotionally detached. She had a documented IQ in the mid-70s and unresolved mental health challenges, yet was deemed fit to stand trial. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Tiffany Hall eventually pleaded guilty to all 5 counts, 4 murders, and the intentional homicide of the unborn child. On June 9, 2008, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Hall remains behind bars in Illinois. The case is a haunting example of betrayal so personal it's nearly impossible to make sense of. A friend, a babysitter, a trusted figure turned killer. In the quiet words of Jamella's mother, Sandra Myers, "I have to forgive her. Taking one life won't bring the others back." This case serves as a somber reminder that the most devastating crimes don't always come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes they come from those who were once closest to us. 4. Lashaun Ternice Harris. In October of 2005, the San Francisco waterfront witnessed a tragedy that stunned the city and the nation. A young mother from Oakland, California, made a decision that would end 3 innocent lives and leave a lasting imprint on the conversation around mental health responsibility and intervention. Lashaun Ternice Harris was 23 years old, a former certified nursing assistant and mother to 3 young boys. She had long battled serious mental illness. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and intellectual disability, Harris had been hospitalized multiple times. Her delusions were well documented, often involving religious visions and voices she believed came from God. On October 19, 2005, Harris boarded a train from Oakland to San Francisco with her sons, 6-year-old Trayshawn, 2-year-old Taranta, and 16-month-old Joshua. They walked along Fisherman's Wharf, ate hot dogs, and made their way toward Pier 7. Witnesses later recalled seeing a calm, quiet woman undressing her children near the water. Some assumed she was simply changing them, but what happened next would defy understanding. One by one, Harris lifted each of her sons and dropped them into the San Francisco Bay. She later told investigators that God had ordered her to send the children to heaven. In her mind, she believed she was fulfilling a divine mission. Only the body of 2-year-old Taranta was recovered. His brothers were never found. Shortly after the act, Harris was seen pushing an empty stroller away from the pier. When approached by officers, she was composed. To them, she said simply, "They're with their father now." Her arrest led to a deeper examination of her past. Harris had a long history of psychiatric hospitalization, with episodes marked by hallucinations, religious delusions, and suicidal thoughts. Her family had pleaded with social services for help, even requesting custody of the children, warning that Lashaun posed a danger to herself and them. But their concerns went unheeded. In 2007, a jury found Lashaun Harris guilty of 3 counts of second-degree murder. But just 1 day later, Judge Ksenia Tissinen declared her legally insane, stating that Harris was incapable of understanding the nature or wrongfulness of her actions. Instead of a life sentence in prison, Harris was committed to a state mental hospital, where she remains today. Her term, 20 years, near to life. The court's decision reflects one of the most difficult intersections in criminal law, when mental illness and violent crime collide. Prosecutors argued she knew what she was doing. The defense insisted she was consumed by delusion. In the end, the judge sided with the evidence of psychosis. This case isn't just about crime, it's about the failure of a system to act on warning signs despite numerous opportunities. Harris's own mother had warned social workers on the very day the children died, but no action came in time. One psychiatrist later testified that Harris believed her children were in heaven, happy and alive, and that she would join them one day. She even asked him to deliver a letter to God by plane. The tragedy of Lashaun Harris is not one of simple evil. It is a story of missed intervention, untreated illness, and the devastating consequences of silence. 3 young lives were lost that day, and with them a community was left asking how many red flags must be raised before someone is finally heard. 5. Malaika Tamu Griffin. In the spring of 1999, a quiet street in Denver, Colorado, became the backdrop to a crime that stunned a community and launched a 6-year manhunt across the country. Malaika Tamu Griffin was born on May 11, 1971. By all appearances, she was intelligent and well-educated. A graduate in chemistry from Jackson State University, she had traveled abroad, kept largely to herself, and was known as quiet, even distant. But behind that reserved persona, there were signs of deep unrest. Her journals, later discovered by police, would reveal a disturbing internal world, one steeped in anger, paranoia, and radical ideology. In early 1999, Griffin moved into a rented room in Denver. Her neighbors were a young couple, Jason Horsley, a 25-year-old carpenter, and his girlfriend. Each evening, Jason would unload tools from his truck in front of the house. It was a simple routine, but to Griffin, it was a provocation. On May 18, 1999, a confrontation unfolded. Griffin and Horsley exchanged heated words over the tools left on the sidewalk, but this was no ordinary dispute. Moments later, Griffin returned to her apartment, retrieved a 9mm handgun with a laser sight, and shot Jason in the back. He died instantly. Griffin didn't wait around. She fled to a friend's house, carjacked her vehicle at gunpoint, and disappeared. That same vehicle was found abandoned days later in Iowa City. By then, Griffin had vanished. The investigation turned up alarming evidence. Inside her apartment, authorities found an assault rifle, grenades, and extremist literature manuals on bomb-making, terrorism, and tactical violence. Her personal writings detailed deep-seated hatred and spoke of an impending race war. These were not idle thoughts. They painted a portrait of someone consumed by resentment and ready for conflict. Despite intense efforts, Griffin evaded capture. She was profiled repeatedly on America's Most Wanted, but no credible leads emerged until 2005. After 6 years on the run, Griffin was living in El Cajon, California, under the name Lake Griffin. She worked at a biotech firm and held part-time jobs at fast food chains and thrift stores. To those around her, she was quiet and unremarkable. But after a rerun of her case aired nationally, co-workers tipped off authorities. When the FBI approached her, she didn't resist. She confirmed her identity and was extradited to Colorado to stand trial. In court, Griffin denied the murder. She claimed the diary entries were part of a fictional play. She testified that the shooting was an accident or an act of self-defense triggered by fear, but the jury wasn't convinced. Her own words, the premeditated nature of the act, and her flight from justice sealed the verdict. On March 5, 2006, Malaika Tamu Griffin was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, she remains incarcerated at La Vista Correctional Facility in Pueblo, Colorado. Griffin's story is a chilling reminder of how personal grievances can spiral into tragedy and how ideology left unchecked can distort reality into justification. It raises lasting questions about how hatred forms and how it hides in plain sight. 6. Margaret Ann Allen. On February 8, 2005, in Titusville, Florida, a confrontation between two friends escalated into one of the most haunting crimes in Brevard County's history. Margaret Ann Allen was no stranger to hardship. Born on January 23, 1966, she grew up in one of Titusville's most troubled neighborhoods. Her father was largely absent, and her youth was marked by exposure to drugs, violence, and poverty. Over time, her record reflected that reality: years of arrests, ranging from drug offenses to violent assaults. Yet amid this chaos, Allen still played the role of mother and friend. She once appeared on the front page of a local newspaper holding her newborn daughter proud and smiling. But what happened in 2005 would forever overshadow any such memories. Allen's relationship with Wenda Wright began as one of trust. Wright worked as her housekeeper, a friend, someone familiar. But when $2,000 allegedly went missing from Allen's purse, suspicion quickly turned to accusation. Prosecutors say what followed was hours of rage, paranoia, and brutality. Margaret Allen believed Wright had stolen from her, and she intended to get a confession. Inside her home, Allen reportedly beat Wright, poured chemicals on her face, and finally used a cloth belt to strangle her. Medical testimony revealed multiple injuries across Wright's body and signs of prolonged trauma. At her most vulnerable, Wright was restrained, held down by Allen's nephew, Quentin Allen, who later testified that he feared for his life if he didn't comply. After Wright lost consciousness, Allen and her two accomplices, Quentin and her roommate James Martin, loaded her body into a car and buried her in a shallow grave near State Road 46. But secrets like these rarely stay buried. 2 days later, police received a tip. Quentin came forward and confessed what he had seen. His testimony led officers directly to the grave, and within 72 hours of the murder, Margaret Allen was under arrest. For her role in the crime, Quentin accepted a plea deal, 15 years for second-degree murder. Martin received 5 years for acting as an accessory. Margaret Allen, however, faced the full weight of justice. At trial, prosecutors painted her as the mastermind, violent, unrelenting, and in control. The defense countered with a portrait of a woman damaged by a lifetime of trauma, shaped by abuse and struggling with mental health. They argued she suffered from brain damage, the result of past assaults, and lacked the capacity to form intent. But the jury was unconvinced. In 2011, 6 years after the crime, Margaret Allen was sentenced to death. All 12 jurors voted unanimously in favor of the penalty. She became only the 3rd woman on Florida's death row at the time, a rare and solemn designation. Today, Allen remains behind bars. Her name is a reminder of the damage left by cycles of poverty, violence, and mistrust, and of the lives torn apart by one devastating decision. For the family of Wenda Wright, the pain remains. Her 2 sons were left without their mother. Her partner, Johnny Dublin, sat silently through trial, overwhelmed by grief. When asked about Allen's fate, he said simply, "I forgive you for what happened." In crimes like these, closure is elusive. But the story stands as a chilling caution that suspicion left unchecked and rage left unresolved can turn even familiarity into fatality. 7. Marie Dean Arrington. Marie Dean Arrington's name doesn't often come up in the usual conversations about American crime history, but in 1969, she became only the 2nd woman ever placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Her story is one of rage, revenge, and the dangerous cost of unchecked fury. Born on August 8, 1933, Marie Arrington came from Florida, where she lived a life marred by instability and violence. She wasn't a career criminal by design, but by circumstance and impulse. Known for her temper and stubborn defiance, she would come to symbolize the thin line between justice and vengeance. Her descent into infamy began in 1964 when she shot and killed her husband during a domestic dispute. Convicted of manslaughter, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But while out on appeal, a new obsession took root: revenge. 2 of her children had been convicted of serious crimes and sentenced to prison. Their defense attorney was a public defender based in Lake County. Though he wasn't the one who committed the crimes or judged the outcomes, Arrington blamed him entirely. When she couldn't get to him directly, she set her sights on someone close to him. On April 22, 1968, 37-year-old Vivian Ritter, the public defender's secretary, disappeared. That morning, witnesses saw Arrington near the office. Later, they spotted her and Ritter driving together in Ritter's car. Hours after the pair was seen in an orange grove outside Leesburg, gunshots echoed through the area. 5 days later, Ritter's body was found in a remote field. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. Ballistics linked the murder to a .22 caliber revolver that Arrington's landlord had once lent her. When police searched her residence, they discovered personal items belonging to Ritter and an ominous unsigned letter threatening that someone would die unless certain inmates were released. Handwriting and witnesses traced it all back to Arrington. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. But even behind bars, her story took another turn. In 1969, while awaiting execution at the Florida Correctional Institution, Arrington escaped. Wearing only pajamas, she cut through a screened window and vanished into the night. Her escape ignited a national manhunt, and within months, she became a face on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, one of only a handful of women to ever appear there. She remained on the run for nearly 3 years. It wasn't until 1971 that authorities finally caught her in New Orleans, living under an alias. For her escape, she received an additional 10-year sentence. Then, in 1972, the Florida Supreme Court struck down the state's capital punishment statute, and her death sentence was commuted to life in prison. She remains incarcerated to this day. Marie Dean Arrington's story is not only a tale of crime and punishment, but a cautionary glimpse into the human psyche pushed to extremes. Her fury was personal, her choices irreversible, and decades later her name still lingers in the quiet corners of American criminal history, a symbol of how far vengeance can reach when justice feels out of grasp. Lolita Barthel. On the surface, Lolita Barthel seemed like any other teenager, 17 years old, starting her senior year at Tampa Bay Tech in Florida, just weeks away from her 18th birthday. But behind that ordinary exterior, a life-altering storm was already unfolding, one that would leave a man dead and a young woman sentenced to spend the rest of her life behind bars. Born on September 6, 1977, Barthel grew up in Tampa, Florida. Her childhood, like many in troubled neighborhoods, was marked by instability and poor influences. By her late teens, she had fallen in with the wrong crowd peers, who saw crime as a thrill, a way out, or simply a means to survive. On August 18, 1995, Barthel and 2 friends targeted 64-year-old Richard Menendez, a floral supply salesman known for his kindness and routine lifestyle. According to testimony later provided by one of Barthel's accomplices, the group had previously robbed elderly victims without confrontation, but this time something went wrong. They forced their way into Menendez's home. He fought back, reaching for the gun. What happened next is the subject of dispute, but the outcome was tragically clear. Menendez was shot and killed. The prosecution claimed Barthel pulled the trigger herself. One of her accomplices, who testified against her in exchange for a lighter sentence, quoted her as saying, "Don't nobody put their hands on me, I'm going to smoke you." Barthel has always denied those words. She insists fear clouded her judgment and that she doesn't even remember the moment she was sentenced. Her arrest came less than a month later, right in her school principal's office. She was charged with first-degree murder and robbery. Tried as an adult despite being a juvenile at the time of the crime, Barthel was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on December 19, 1996. She was 19 years old when she entered Jefferson Correctional Institution near Tallahassee. There, the reality of her sentence hit her not in the courtroom, but in the prison yard, surrounded by women decades older, many of whom had also entered the system as teens and never left. Over the years, Barthel has reflected on her fate with quiet resignation. In one interview, she explained her survival strategy, blocking out the pain, mentally distancing herself from the permanence of her reality. "To me, I don't cope," she said. "I just try to believe something totally different." Today, Lolita Barthel remains incarcerated in Florida, far from her family, far from freedom. Her mother, Loretha, still visits when she can, clinging to hope, praying for a miracle. Every Christmas, Lolita sends her mother a magazine clipping of a watch, a small echo of the gifts she once gave when she was free. Her case raises difficult questions about youth accountability and the justice system's treatment of minors. Was she a cold-hearted killer or a frightened teenager who made an irreversible mistake? The court saw a dangerous offender. Others see a life frozen at 17. And somewhere in a Florida prison, that young girl is now a grown woman, still waiting for time to move again. 9. Lutrische Dancy. Lutrische Dancy was not a name known outside of Miami until the fall of 2003. Born on August 15, 1962, she led a quiet life on the surface, one that gave little warning of the violent unraveling that would follow. But on October 1st of that year, a crime unfolded behind closed doors that shocked a neighborhood and stunned investigators. The victim was her husband, a 51-year-old man, whose life ended inside the couple's Miami-Dade County home. The details, while carefully handled in court, revealed a disturbing effort not only to take a life, but to erase all trace of it. It began with silence. Neighbors hadn't seen the man in days. Then came the smell. Residents on the block reported an overwhelming, unnatural odor coming from the home. Concerned and alarmed, they contacted authorities. What police found inside wasn't just a crime scene, it was a calculated attempt at concealment. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition. Investigators determined that the man had been shot. After the fact, Dancy had reportedly poured acid over him and attempted to set the body on fire, an effort they concluded to destroy evidence and delay identification. Within 5 days, Lutrische Dancy was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The motive prosecutors didn't publicly disclose all details during pre-trial hearings, but the case presented to the court painted a picture of a relationship strained by control, secrecy, and growing volatility. Dancy did not deny being in the home, but she pleaded not guilty to the charge of murder. Her defense would center around intent and state of mind, two critical elements in determining the weight of justice. Her trial proceeded in Miami-Dade County, where a jury weighed the evidence with deliberation. Witnesses testified, forensic experts detailed the scene, and prosecutors emphasized the calculated nature of the aftermath. In the end, the verdict was clear. On November 15, 2005, Lutrische Dancy was sentenced to 45 years in prison. She was 43 years old at the time of sentencing. Now she remains incarcerated in the Florida correctional system, largely out of the public eye, her name forgotten by many, but her actions leaving a lasting impression on those who followed the case. The Dancy case stands as one of those haunting examples, where the surface of a relationship concealed a slow descent into something far more destructive. It's a reminder that not all violence is loud or sudden. Sometimes it's the quiet, the absence of noise that signals something far more unsettling. In the end, the truth emerged not from confessions or confrontation, but from a neighborhood that noticed something was wrong and spoke up. And in that silence, justice found its way through. Some stories fade quickly. This one lingered in the air in the courtroom and in the quiet questions it leaves behind. 10. Jacqueline Annette Williams. In the quiet suburban town of Addison, Illinois, the events of November 16, 1995, would leave a permanent scar on the community and become one of the most chilling crimes in the state's history. At the center of it all was Jacqueline Annette Williams, a woman whose desperate pursuit of motherhood would spiral into a nightmare no one could have imagined. Born on December 22, 1966, Williams had a seemingly ordinary upbringing in Wheaton. She was raised in a tight-knit family, did well in school, and attended church. But by the time she reached adulthood, something had changed. Diagnosed later with personality disorders and severe depression, Jacqueline became known for being manipulative, emotionally unstable, and easily influenced by others. In the months leading up to the murders, Williams told friends and family she was pregnant. She threw a baby shower, prepared a nursery, and even produced a forged birth certificate. But there was no pregnancy. What followed was a plan so disturbing that it defied comprehension. Williams, her boyfriend Fidel Caffey, and her cousin Leverin Ward, who was the biological father of two of Deborah Evans' children, targeted Evans, a 28-year-old mother of three, who was days away from delivering her fourth child. On November 16th, the trio entered Deborah's apartment. She was killed and her unborn baby was taken from her womb. Williams took the newborn boy and fled the scene with Caffey. Deborah's 10-year-old daughter Samantha was also murdered at the apartment she had witnessed too much. 2-year-old Jordan was left behind unharmed, but alone with the bodies of his mother and sister. Hours later, the body of Deborah's 7-year-old son Joshua was discovered in an alley in Maywood. He had been taken from the home held overnight and then silenced because he too could identify the attackers. The next day, police arrested Jacqueline Williams. She was holding the newborn child, whom she had named Elijah. Miraculously, he had survived. The trial that followed was swift. The evidence, physical, testimonial, and circumstantial, painted a damning picture. Friends testified to her fake pregnancy. Witnesses confirmed she was present during the murders. A jury took only 2 hours to find her guilty of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. On May 11, 1998, Williams was sentenced to death. But in 2003, Illinois Governor George Ryan commuted the sentences of all death row inmates. Jacqueline Williams' punishment became life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, she remains incarcerated. In recent years, she has petitioned for clemency and expressed remorse. "I am guilty," she wrote, "but not of all of this." Prosecutors remain unconvinced, calling her appeals a plea from someone who already received the break of a lifetime. For the Evans family, the pain never left. Yet in the midst of such darkness, there is a small light. Elijah and Jordan, the 2 children who survived, were raised by their grandfather in rural Illinois. They represent not only the resilience of life, but a reminder of what was lost and what was taken. Some crimes fade with time. This one remains a story of obsession, betrayal, and the lives left in its wake. Dorothy Williams. In the late 1980s, the South Side of Chicago was home to a quiet terror, one that lived unnoticed among the city's most vulnerable residents. Behind a series of crimes that shocked and saddened a community was Dorothy Williams, a woman who appeared at first glance to be just another face in the crowd. But her name would come to symbolize betrayal, manipulation, and cold calculation. Born on December 24, 1954, Dorothy Williams battled addiction throughout her life, particularly to heroin, a struggle that would eventually fuel a deadly crime spree. Despite a history of low-level offenses and drug use, no one could have predicted the extent of the violence she would unleash. Between 1987 and 1989, Williams committed a series of robberies and murders, each targeting elderly victims who lived alone in senior housing. Her first known murder occurred on December 5, 1987, when 79-year-old Lonnie Laws was found strangled in his apartment. 1 year later, she struck again, this time stabbing 64-year-old Cesar Zuel. But it was the third killing in the summer of 1989 that would ultimately lead to her capture. On July 25, 1989, 97-year-old Mary Harris welcomed a visitor into her apartment, someone she likely didn't know was dangerous. According to Williams' later confession, she had entered under false pretenses, accepted $2 from Harris to run an errand, then attacked her from behind in a desperate attempt to steal the stereo she intended to sell for drug money. Harris was strangled with the scarf she wore on her head, and her apartment was ransacked, but this time Williams left behind more than just devastation. Witnesses saw her leaving the building with a large box. Fingerprints were found at the scene, and soon police recovered the stolen stereo from her apartment. She was arrested on September 6, 1989. Over the next few days, Williams confessed to multiple crimes, providing graphic and shifting accounts to police and prosecutors. Her final court-reported confession sealed her fate. On April 18, 1991, Dorothy Williams was sentenced to death for the murder and robbery of Mary Harris. In subsequent proceedings, she pleaded guilty to the murders of Laws and Zuel and received additional life sentences. She was also convicted in multiple robberies of elderly victims, including one man confined to a wheelchair, though her attorneys later argued that Williams was mentally unfit. Experts and judges found her competent and, more tellingly, manipulative. She had a pattern of changing her story, faking symptoms, and attempting to avoid responsibility. Psychological evaluations described her as street smart, calculated, and ruthless in her crimes. In 2003, Illinois Governor George Ryan commuted all death sentences in the state to life imprisonment, sparing Williams from execution. Today, she remains incarcerated without the possibility of parole. Dorothy Williams' legacy is not just that of a serial offender. It is a haunting case of predation within places meant to be safe. Her victims, elderly and trusting, died in their own homes, opening the door to someone who saw them not as people, but as opportunities. And in those quiet hallways where safety once lived, her shadow still lingers. 12. Andrea Hicks Jackson. On a humid May evening in 1983, a traffic stop on the streets of Jacksonville, Florida, spiraled into a moment that would haunt the city for decades. In the center of it all stood a young woman known only to a few as Felix, but her real name, Andrea Hicks Jackson, would soon be etched into Florida's criminal history. Born on February 26, 1958, Andrea Hicks Jackson grew up in Jacksonville. By her mid-20s, she had already crossed paths with law enforcement, but nothing could have predicted the violent encounter that would come. Described by some as defiant and impulsive, Jackson was a complex figure whose actions defied explanation and whose courtroom journey would challenge the very definition of justice. It was May 16, 1983. Officer Gary Bevel, just 29 years old, was dispatched to arrest Jackson on a relatively minor charge, filing a false police report about damage to her car. But as Officer Bevel attempted to place her in custody near 26th Street and Boulevard, Jackson resisted. In the ensuing scuffle, she dropped her keys, some say as a distraction, and drew a firearm. 6 shots were fired. Officer Bevel was struck multiple times and died at the scene. The crime shocked the community and law enforcement alike. Within hours, Jackson was arrested. She was charged with first-degree murder and faced the ultimate penalty. Her first trial came swiftly. In 1984, Jackson was sentenced to death, but the verdict, like the ones that followed, would not stand. Over the next 16 years, her case became a legal odyssey. 4 separate juries recommended the death penalty, and 4 times the Florida Supreme Court overturned the sentence, not the conviction, but the sentences, each time citing procedural missteps or constitutional errors. Testimony deemed prejudicial, jury instructions called improper, and even Jackson's own absence from a hearing became grounds for reversal. Despite repeated attempts by the state to reaffirm the death penalty in June 2000, the long legal battle reached an unexpected end. Judge Donald Moran, who had previously sentenced Jackson to death on multiple occasions, commuted her sentence to life in prison. In a surprising moment, he acknowledged his frustration with the repeated rulings from the state's highest court and expressed a desire for finality. Though he stated the sentence was without parole, the laws in effect at the time of Jackson's crime meant she could be eligible for parole as early as 2009. To the victim's family, to Jacksonville's law enforcement, and to many in the public, the ruling felt like a betrayal. Officer Bevel, a respected and dedicated officer, was taken in the line of duty. For some, Jackson's commuted sentence was a reminder of how the justice system can bend, twist, and ultimately elude a definitive conclusion. Today, Andrea Hicks Jackson remains incarcerated, no longer on death row, but her case continues to stir debate. Is it a story of justice served or justice delayed beyond recognition? One thing remains certain: a single encounter, a moment of resistance, and the pulling of a trigger changed two lives forever. One ended and one suspended in the echoes of a courtroom that refused to close. 13. Laisha Latae Landrum. In the summer of 2004, beneath the heat pad of a Florida night, a confrontation fueled by jealousy would leave a community in disbelief, and a promising young life cut tragically short. At the center of it stood Laisha Latae Landrum, a 16-year-old from Tampa, Florida, whose life was about to be rewritten in the harshest terms imaginable. Born in July of 1987, Landrum was a young mother and a high school dropout who had earned her GED while working at a local Wendy's. On the surface, she was like many teenagers trying to find her place, juggling responsibilities far beyond her years. But behind that exterior, something darker had begun to fester, an emotional storm rooted in betrayal, obsession, and resentment. At just 16, Landrum was living with her boyfriend, Rocky Almastica Jr., and caring for their infant daughter, but their domestic life was far from stable. Tensions escalated when Landrum learned that Rocky had allegedly rekindled a secret relationship with his ex-girlfriend, 16-year-old Emily Clemens. What happened next was a calculated descent into violence. On the night of June 9, 2004, Landrum and Almastica lured Emily to the Amaretto Apartments in North Tampa. Inside the apartment, a confrontation erupted. Prosecutors later revealed that Emily was struck repeatedly with a hammer metal kitchen pots, and even a stereo boombox bludgeoned more than 30 times. When the attack was over and Emily's battered body was wrapped in a blanket and discarded in a nearby dumpster, but Emily was still alive, it was only because nearby residents heard faint banging noises coming from the trash bin that authorities were alerted. By the time deputies arrived, Emily was barely clinging to life. She would later die in the hospital from her injuries. Landrum was arrested the very next day and charged with first-degree murder and evidence tampering. Almastica had already been convicted and sentenced to life the previous year. Now it was her turn to face the consequences. Throughout the trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a teen consumed by jealousy and rage. A voicemail she left for Emily before the murder was played in court. "Stay away from my man, or I'll kill you." Defense attorneys argued that Landrum had not delivered the fatal blows, that she was young, provoked, and capable of redemption, but the jury saw otherwise. On February 20, 2006, Laisha Landrum was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Just 18 years old, she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Today, Landrum remains incarcerated, separated not only from freedom but from the daughter she last saw as an infant. Her case is a chilling reminder of how powerful emotions, when left unchecked, can spiral into irreversible tragedy. What makes this case resonate isn't just the brutality of the crime, but the ages of those involved. 3 teenagers entangled in a toxic triangle made choices that shattered multiple lives, and at the center of it all was a young girl who never got the chance to grow up. Justice was served, but the question remained, what could have stopped it? And how do we prevent another heartbreak born from teenage rage? 14. Tivasha Logan. In a quiet Lakeland neighborhood nestled in the heart of Polk County, Florida, the life of an innocent infant came to a heartbreaking end. The events that unfolded in the fall of 2009 would leave a community shaken and a mother behind bars for the rest of her life. Tivasha Evan Logan was 25 years old, a mother of 6, living in a modest home with her boyfriend Chauncey Gardner. While the refrigerator and pantry were filled with food, what was missing would come to define a tragedy that defied understanding. At the center of it was her youngest child, 5-month-old Chauncey Gardner. Born prematurely in May 2009, Chauncey fought hard for life, gaining enough strength to leave the hospital at a healthy weight. But in the months that followed, something went terribly wrong. Investigators later revealed that the baby was being fed formula mixed with 3 parts water, just a third of the nutrition recommended by doctors. It was a quiet form of neglect, one that unfolded slowly and visibly until it was too late. Logan admitted she had noticed her daughter was losing weight. Family members urged her to take the baby to a doctor, but she didn't. When questioned, Logan confessed that she feared authorities might take her other 5 children away, so she waited. A doctor's appointment was scheduled for November 2nd, but on the morning of November 1st, it was already too late. Emergency services responded to a call about an unresponsive infant. Paramedics arrived to find Chauncey lifeless on the floor. She weighed just 6 pounds less than when she left the hospital months earlier. The autopsy confirmed the unthinkable: the child had starved to death. The arrest was swift. Both Tivasha Logan and Chauncey Gardner were charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. Prosecutors pursued a theory of felony murder, arguing that Logan's actions, though not violent in nature, were so reckless, so indifferent to her daughter's life, that they met the legal standard for the most serious charge. Logan's defense painted a different picture: a mother with limited intellectual ability, a reading level below the national average, and a genuine lack of understanding about the severity of her child's condition. Her attorney claimed she never intended harm, that she believed she had time, and that fear clouded her judgment. But the jury saw it differently. After hours of deliberation, they found her guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated manslaughter. On July 11, 2012, Tivasha Logan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, she remains incarcerated in the Florida correctional system. The father, Chauncey Gardner, also faces similar charges and awaits his own legal reckoning. This case stands as a stark reminder that neglect can be just as lethal as action, and that fear, when left unchecked, can silence even the most urgent cries for help. In the words of the judge, "I can't comprehend how any reasonable person could look at that child and not see what was happening. Justice was served, but for Chauncey Gardner, justice came too late." 15. Tonya Thomas. In the early morning hours of May 15, 2012, silence was shattered in the quiet community of Port St. John, Florida. A mother, Tonya Thomas, stood outside her home calling her children back inside. Minutes later, all 4 of them would be dead. Tonya Thomas was 33 years old. A single mother raising 4 children, ages 12 to 17. On the surface, her life seemed hard but ordinary. Beneath that surface, however, was a history marked by domestic violence, emotional isolation, and growing instability. Records later revealed a troubled past childhood abuse, a volatile relationship with the children's father, and multiple visits from authorities regarding disputes at home. Still, there was no clear sign that this mother was on the brink of something unthinkable. That night, sometime after 3 a.m., Thomas sent a text message to a friend. It read, "Tell my mom what happened. I want to be cremated with my children." It was chilling, quietly revealing what was to come. Then she retrieved a .38 caliber revolver and began what would become one of the most disturbing family tragedies in Florida's recent history. 3 of her children, Joel, Jaslyn, and Jax's, managed to flee to a neighbor's house, bleeding and begging for help. But confusion set in. Unsure who the shooter was, the neighbors refused to open their doors. Then Tonya Thomas stepped outside. Calmly, quietly, she called out to her children, "Come home, bam." And they did. What happened next was tragically swift. Thomas shot each of her children several times. She then lit a cigarette, walked back inside, and took her own life. Police arrived within minutes, but by then, the damage was done. 4 children were dead: Joel, 12, Jaslyn, 13, Jax's 15, and Pebbles, the eldest, just 17. The scene was devastating, the motive elusive. Authorities found no suicide note beyond the text message. The gun was registered to no known owner, but what they did find was a pattern. In the weeks leading up to the incident, police had responded to multiple domestic disturbances. One involved Jax, who had reportedly become violent with his mother. There were tensions in the home. Yet during welfare checks, all 4 children told investigators they felt safe, that their mother wasn't abusive. It seemed outwardly like a family under pressure, but not in danger. Tonya Thomas's story is both haunting and confounding. She had reached out for help in the past. She had lived through abuse, but no one, not law enforcement, not her neighbors, not even her children, seemed to anticipate what she was capable of. Today, the house on Bright Avenue is quiet once again, but the echoes of that morning linger. A family lost, a community in mourning, and a question that may never be answered: why? As a Department of Children and Families spokesperson said, "These files offer a glimpse inside the family's home, but they do not contain the answer we all seek." Sometimes in true crime, the greatest mystery isn't how, but why. And in this case, the silence speaks volumes. 16. Meriel Bemis. On a quiet February evening in 2014, the suburban stillness of Stone Mountain, Georgia, was shattered by a 911 call that no one could have anticipated. A call from a man who had just returned to his apartment to find the unthinkable. The caller was Troy Walker. His girlfriend, 21-year-old Meriel Bemis, had just told him something incomprehensible: that she had taken the life of her own daughter, 3-year-old Layla Bemis. Meriel Bemis didn't have a criminal past. She wasn't known to neighbors as violent or unstable. On social media, she portrayed a life filled with warmth, creativity, and affection. She described herself as artsy, a dancer, and a proud mother. Photos showed her embracing her boyfriend, laughing with her daughter, but behind those images lay unresolved pain, abandonment, instability, and a desperate need to be loved. That Sunday, February 23rd, things unraveled. According to court documents, Meriel and her boyfriend had argued over text messages he'd received from another woman. The argument escalated. He left the apartment. She tried to reach him. Calls, texts, more calls, but he refused to respond. And then in a moment authorities later described as both emotional and impulsive, Meriel suffocated her daughter using a pillow. She then called Walker and confessed through screams, "I killed her." He returned immediately, finding Layla unresponsive. He dialed 911 and attempted CPR, but it was too late. Layla was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. An autopsy confirmed the cause of death: suffocation. Meriel was arrested the same day. During her interrogation, she confessed not only to the crime but to her mental state, saying she had also tried to take her own life afterward. Her attorney later revealed a deeper emotional context. Meriel was adopted, often felt unwanted, and struggled with abandonment and emotional regulation. The relationship with her boyfriend had been her anchor. When it broke, so did she. The legal outcome was swift. On September 11th, 2014, Meriel Bemis pleaded guilty to felony murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison. There was no trial, no long deliberation, just a quiet courtroom where justice was rendered and where a small girl's life was remembered. Prosecutors expressed the grief and disbelief shared by many. As a mother, I could not begin to understand how and why she would take the life of her innocent child, said Assistant District Attorney Elizabeth Racine. And yet within the walls of that courtroom, the story wasn't only about guilt. It was about a life of emotional instability, untreated trauma, and the collapse of a young woman who had nowhere to turn. Today, Meriel Bemis remains behind bars serving a life sentence. She will never again walk free. And Layla's memory lives on not just in court documents, but in the haunting question that lingers. After all the facts are laid bare, how does love unravel into tragedy? It's a case that offers no easy answers. Only it's a painful reminder of how quickly silence can follow screams, and how unseen pain can become irreversible. 17. Ebony Passion Smith. On a summer evening in July 2011, a quiet home in Warner Robins, Georgia, became the site of a tragedy that would leave two families shattered and a community stunned. The life of Brian Smith, husband, father, and U.S. Air Force mechanic, ended in a hail of bullets. The person responsible, his wife, Ebony Passion Smith. Ebony Smith, then 32, wasn't a stranger to hardship. Friends described her as private, sometimes withdrawn, and often emotionally fragile. She had struggled with mental health, including a diagnosis of severe depressive disorder with psychotic features. She was also a mother of two, including a young daughter she shared with Brian. But on July 15th, everything changed quickly, irrevocably, and violently. That afternoon, Ebony was served with divorce papers. The couple had been married for years. Their relationship had become strained, marked by arguments, mistrust, and accusations of infidelity. What triggered Ebony that day wasn't just the legal end of their marriage. It was the belief that Brian was trying to take their daughter away. According to prosecutors, Ebony waited for her husband to return home armed with his own .40 caliber Glock handgun. When he arrived without their daughter, an argument escalated into confrontation. In a matter of moments, Ebony shot Brian multiple times, striking his chest, abdomen, limbs, and hand. He collapsed in the hallway bathroom. Moments later, Ebony swallowed a handful of pills in an attempt to end her own life. When police arrived, they found Ebony semi-conscious, hiding beneath blankets in the master bedroom. She admitted to the shooting but said she never meant to kill Brian, only herself. The gun, now empty, was at the foot of the bed. Prescription bottles lay scattered nearby. Ebony was hospitalized, then transferred to a psychiatric facility. For months, she remained under care before being deemed competent to stand trial. In court, her defense argued for voluntary manslaughter, claiming she acted in the heat of passion, overwhelmed by the fear of losing her child. But prosecutors contended otherwise, that she had time to think, to reflect, and to choose another path. The jury agreed. On August 7, 2013, Ebony Passion Smith was found guilty of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and firearm possession during a crime. The next day, she was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She offered no words in her own defense. Her lawyer said she felt unworthy of sympathy, and her silence was a sign of remorse. Still, for Brian Smith's family, the loss was immeasurable. His daughter, just 4 years old at the time, was left without parents. His brothers traumatized. His mother devastated. "He was my refuge," she wrote in a statement to the court. Today, Ebony remains incarcerated in Georgia. Her case, though closed in court, continues to echo through the lives it touched. A split-second decision made in emotional chaos. Now sentenced to a lifetime of consequences. And a child caught in the middle continues to grow up with the echoes of a tragedy she may never fully understand. 18. Yvette Taylor. In the early hours of February 11, 2012, a quiet apartment complex in Martinez, Georgia, became the focus of an intense homicide investigation. The victim, 63-year-old Theodore Crew. The suspect, his 47-year-old roommate Yvette Taylor, a woman with a troubling and violent past. Yvette Taylor wasn't unknown to law enforcement. Decades earlier in 1991, she had been charged in the shooting death of her younger brother. She claimed it was an accident, the result of a struggle over a gun. He had been shot 3 times in the right eye. Just before trial, she pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years. That history would return to haunt her. In 2012, Taylor was living with Theodore Crew in the Apple Cross Apartments. Their relationship was not romantic by all accounts. She was his roommate and possibly his caregiver, but that care came with rising tension. Neighbors later testified that Taylor had complained about Crew, saying she was tired of cleaning up after him, tired of the responsibility. On the morning of February 11th, Taylor called 911 and reported simply that her friend was dead. First responders arrived to find a grim scene, blood spattered across the living room, down the hallway, and into the bathroom, where Crew lay lifeless. The bathroom floor had been soaked with water and bleach, as if someone had tried to erase the truth. Investigators immediately noted the inconsistencies in Taylor's story. She claimed to have spent the night at her mother's apartment only to return and discover Crew's body. But her mother and aunt later admitted that wasn't true. Taylor had only arrived that morning with a bag that was later found hidden in the woods, containing bloody clothes and a box cutter. Neighbors reported hearing yelling, scuffling, and loud thuds in the early hours of that morning, sounds they would later describe as disturbing and unnatural. During her videotaped interview, Taylor denied any involvement. Yet after her arrest, she told a jail deputy, "I cut him, I admit that, but I didn't kill him." It was a partial confession that spoke volumes. The autopsy revealed a brutal truth. Theodore Crew had died from a combination of sharp and blunt force injuries. His face and body bore the signs of a violent assault. Despite her denials, the forensic evidence and her own words told a different story. In February 2013, after a 3-day trial and 4 hours of deliberation, a Columbia County jury found Yvette Taylor guilty of felony murder. Though she was acquitted of malice murder, the judge sentenced her to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, citing her as a continued threat to the community. Today, Yvette Taylor remains behind bars. Her story is a chilling reminder that violence can simmer quietly beneath the surface, and when it erupts, the consequences can be deadly. This case also underscores a deeper pattern, from the death of her brother to assaults in later years, and ultimately to the killing of her roommate. Taylor's history reveals a chain of unresolved conflict, anger, and instability that ended in tragedy for the victims and for those left to wonder why. 19. LaTosha Cunningham. On May 18, 2011, an 85-year-old woman named Yoko Cullen walked out of a Collinsville, Illinois bingo hall for what should have been just another quiet evening. Instead, it was the last time she would ever be seen alive. Yoko was known in her community as a gentle, independent grandmother who enjoyed the simple routine of bingo nights. She was beloved, kind, and tragically unsuspecting of the evil that lay in wait. That night, she became the target of a violent scheme, one fueled not by desperation, but by greed. LaTosha Cunningham, known to some as Net, was a familiar face at the same bingo hall. At 37, she already carried a violent past. In 1993, she was convicted of robbing and shooting another elderly woman. Now, nearly 2 decades later, she had a new plan, one far more sinister. Alongside cousins DeQuan and DeMarcus Barnes, Cunningham waited in the parking lot as bingo players began leaving. They had chosen Yoko Cullen specifically believing she carried cash from her winnings and mistaking her modest life for wealth. As Cullen left the hall, the group flashed their headlights to stop her. They forced her into the trunk of her own car, then drove to a remote area in East St. Louis, a location known as a dumping ground for stolen vehicles. It was there that Yoko's final moments unfolded, moments that would later shake even the most seasoned detectives. Investigators later found surveillance footage, blood-stained weapons, and ATM records that placed all three suspects at the heart of the crime. Despite initially denying involvement, LaTosha Cunningham eventually changed her story when confronted with confessions from her accomplices. According to her statement, she stood by as Daquan struck Yoko with a tire iron. She later drove the group to a gas station, bought fuel, and returned to the site where the car with Yoko still in the trunk was set ablaze. The forensic evidence was chilling. Soot found in Yoko's airways confirmed she had still been breathing when the fire began, all for what, roughly $390 in bingo money. The suspects split it 3 ways. 3 days after the murder, Cunningham was arrested. In court, she collapsed and vomited before the judge, an act that stood in stark contrast to her alleged indifference just days earlier. But the evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage showed her trying to use Yoko's credit cards. Blood on a tire iron matched the victim, and cell phone records placed her at the scene. On December 11, 2013, LaTosha Cunningham was sentenced to 60 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Daquan Barnes received the same sentence. DeMarcus Barnes was ruled mentally unfit to stand trial. Today, LaTosha Cunningham remains behind bars. Her name is etched into Illinois criminal history as the woman who helped orchestrate one of the most senseless and brutal acts of betrayal against the elderly. Yoko Cullen's family never got to say goodbye. Her life, so full of warmth and routine, was stolen by someone she may have once called a neighbor, a reminder that sometimes the greatest threats can come from those hiding in plain sight. 20. Latasha Pulliam. In the spring of 1991, a name would enter the criminal archives of Illinois, etched not for notoriety, but for its haunting echo of betrayal, depravity, and psychological disturbance. Latasha Pulliam, born in 1971 and raised on Chicago's South Side, was just 19 when she committed a crime so chilling it stunned even seasoned investigators. Those who knew Pulliam described her as quiet and distant. But behind the surface, psychologists would later debate whether she was mentally impaired or calculated, a young woman shaped by abuse, addiction, and trauma, or something far more sinister. One state expert gave her a chilling label, a female John Gacy, a disturbing comparison for anyone, let alone a teenager. On March 21, 1991, Pulliam lured 6-year-old Shenosha Richards, her neighbor's daughter, into her apartment. The child had trusted her. She had no reason not to. But over the next several hours, Pulliam and her boyfriend, Dwight Jordan, subjected the young girl to unfathomable cruelty. When it was over, Pulliam hid the child's body in a garbage can. That same day, Pulliam was arrested. Her confession, delivered to authorities in stark detail, matched the forensic evidence investigators later found. She described events with an unsettling level of calm, offering no excuse, only the facts. In court, prosecutors built a case around her confession, the recovered physical evidence and testimony from medical and psychological experts. The jury heard that Pulliam's behavior was not the result of a momentary lapse, but sustained deliberate acts of violence. Though her defense team raised claims of mental impairment and a history of abuse, jurors were unmoved. She was convicted of first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated criminal sexual assault, and 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping. The sentence, death. But her story didn't end there. In 2003, over a decade after her conviction, the governor of Illinois made a sweeping decision commuting the sentences of all 167 inmates on death row among them Latasha Pulliam. Her death sentence was reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She remains incarcerated to this day. More than 3 decades later, the name Latasha Pulliam remains a grim reminder of the fragility of innocence and the darkness that can hide in plain sight. The case continues to stir debate not just about the crime itself, but about how the justice system handles individuals with histories of abuse, addiction, and mental illness. One expert's words still linger: she got satisfaction from hurting someone weaker than her. Whether this was the result of her environment or her own pathology, the consequences were irreversible. And while the legal chapters are closed, the emotional weight of the case continues to ripple through a community, a grieving family, and a justice system that still grapples with the question, how do you explain the unexplainable? 21. Willa Glendora Blank. Willa Glendora Blank. A name now etched into the darker corners of Boone County, Kentucky. Once a seemingly ordinary cleaning lady, Blank earned a new title from stunned investigators and stunned neighbors alike: Corvette Girl. But behind the flashy sports car, the Versace glasses, and her confident charm hid something much colder. Born in 1961, Willa Blank was no stranger to financial instability, and over time, it seems desperation gave way to calculated ambition. When she crossed paths with Walter Sartre in 2008, the pieces of a chilling plan began to fall into place. Walter Sartre was a 73-year-old reclusive millionaire, a former nuclear scientist at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and a brilliant mathematician. But he was also a man haunted by mental illness. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, Sartre lived a quiet, isolated life in Hebron, Kentucky. He avoided people, trusted few, and feared many. Tragically, those fears were not unfounded. Blank met Sartori while cleaning a neighbor's home. She began dropping by uninvited, inserting herself into his life with alarming persistence. Sartori grew suspicious. He even changed his locks, fearing she'd taken his key. He voiced these fears to online friends, the only family he truly had. But by the time they sounded the alarm, it was already too late. Investigators believe that in mid-February of 2009, Blank, with the help of her son Louis Wilkinson, kidnapped Sartori and held him in the basement of her home. He was duct-taped to a chair, drugged, isolated. Detectives later revealed he died within a week. Blank's next moves were swift and methodical. Using forged documents, she added herself to Sartori's bank accounts, transferred over $210,000, and accessed millions more. She told a car dealer she was expecting $7 million. She gambled, she shopped, and then she disposed of the body. The remains, burned beyond recognition, were found in Indiana's Morgan Monroe State Forest on March 13, 2009, hidden inside a trash can. When confronted, Blank claimed they were simply burning a dead dog. But the evidence told another story. On March 14th, Blank and her son were arrested at a motel in Ohio. In the months that followed, prosecutors built their case meticulously. Books on Blank's shelf included legal manuals and one title that stopped investigators cold: How to Choose Your Prey. In 2011, facing the death penalty, Willa Blank pled guilty to kidnapping, exploitation, and abuse of a corpse. She received life in prison without the possibility of parole. In court, she showed no remorse, not once. As for her son, his legal path unfolded separately, with questions about his mental fitness and role in the crime. Walter Sartori's life was marked by brilliance and by fear. He distrusted strangers and sought refuge in the digital friendships he formed online. Ironically, it was those very friends who ensured his disappearance didn't go unnoticed, who spoke for him in court when he could no longer speak for himself. He had no reason to be killed, like that one friend said. He is missed. The case of Willa Blank isn't just a story of greed. It's a cautionary tale of trust, betrayed, of vulnerability, exploited, and of a man whose worst fears became his reality. Sometimes the most dangerous predators don't hide in the shadows. Sometimes they wear a smile and drive a red Corvette. 22. Nadia Braxton. In a quiet Kenner neighborhood, just outside New Orleans, a small house on East Louisiana State Drive held a family trying to stay afloat. Nadia Braxton, 29 years old, was a mother of 3 devoted private and, to most around her, perfectly ordinary, but beneath the surface something was unraveling, something no one around her truly saw until it was too late. Nadia had no criminal record, no history of violence. Friends and neighbors described her as quiet, even sweet. She stayed home to raise her daughters Kayla, age 12, Naya, just a toddler, and baby Nyla, only 6 months old. Her partner Ronald Peters worked long hours in construction and plumbing to provide for them. They lived modestly, but they had dreams. Nadia, it's said, had once enrolled in pharmacy classes at the University of New Orleans, but life had begun closing in. The family was in the midst of a foreclosure battle, their home seized more than once by the sheriff's office. On the very day everything changed, July 12, 2011, a court order was filed to begin formal eviction. To everyone else, Nadia appeared composed. But behind closed doors, a storm was brewing. And in the days leading up to the tragedy, she reached out not to family or friends, but to a pastor she hadn't seen in nearly 6 years. She told him she felt hopeless, anxious, lost. The pastor responded with prayer, with words of comfort, and an invitation to call. She did, but when she called that Tuesday morning, he was busy running a summer camp at the church. He tried calling back, but no one answered. That evening, Ronald Peters returned home from work. He called out for his family, no reply. Upstairs in the bedroom, he found them, all 4, gone. Police say the gun, one Nadia had owned for years, was found at the foot of the bed. All signs pointed to a murder-suicide. Nadia, overwhelmed and spiraling, had taken her daughters' lives, and then her own. Investigators later confirmed there were no signs of struggle, no history of domestic violence, no warnings. It was, by all accounts, a heartbreaking eruption of internal pain that no one around her had truly detected. The community was stunned. Her mother expressed disbelief. She was hurting so bad, she said, but I didn't know the extent. The pastor echoed the sentiment. He'd known Nadia since her youth, baptized her himself. She was a joy. He remembered a lovely person. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of this story, how invisible despair can be. There were no police calls, no arguments, no obvious signs, just quiet suffering behind a closed door. Nadia Braxton's case leaves behind no court dates, no trial, only a chilling silence and questions that may never be fully answered. What pushes someone to that edge, and how can a cry for help go unheard? Sometimes the loudest screams are the ones never spoken. 23. Antoinette Frank. Antoinette Frank had always wanted to be a police officer. Growing up in Louisiana with a fractured family and a troubled past, she clung to the idea that wearing a badge might give her life order, purpose. But what she became wasn't a protector. It was something far more sinister. By 1993, Frank had joined the New Orleans Police Department. Her path there, however, was riddled with red flags. She'd failed psychological screenings, lied on her application, and even disappeared briefly after leaving a suicide note. But the NOPD, desperate for recruits, hired her anyway. In uniform, she projected confidence. But off-duty, her life was unraveling. She began a relationship with 18-year-old Rogers Lacaze, a known drug dealer with a violent past. The two grew inseparable. Witnesses later testified that Lacaze often drove her patrol car and even accompanied her on calls. It was an open secret among officers. On March 4, 1995, Frank and Lacaze returned for the 3rd time that evening to Kim An, a Vietnamese restaurant where Frank moonlighted as a security guard alongside fellow officer Ronald Williams. It was just past 2 a.m. The restaurant had closed for the night. Sensing something was off, Chow Vu, one of the owner's daughters, hid the night's earnings in a microwave. Moments later, Frank entered, using a stolen key, her badge still on her demeanor cold. Then the shots began. Officer Ronald Williams, Frank's colleague and supposed friend, was gunned down. Lacaze, armed and violent, had followed Frank inside. As chaos unfolded, Chow and her siblings, Kwok, Ha, and Kwang, tried to hide. Kwok and Chow made it to a cooler. Ha and Kwang didn't. From their hiding place, Chow and Kwok heard more gunfire. When they emerged, their brother and sister were gone, victims of what would be remembered as one of the most disturbing betrayals in New Orleans law enforcement history. But the most shocking twist, Frank returned to the scene minutes later in a police cruiser, pretending to investigate. She tried to blend in, asking questions, even approaching Chow for information. But Chow knew exactly who she was and what she had done. She told the responding officers, "That's her, that's who did it." Frank was arrested the same day. During questioning, she eventually confessed, but tried to place the blame on Lacaze. The evidence, however, told a different story. By October 1995, both Frank and Lacaze had been convicted and sentenced to death. Frank's trial took just over a week. The jury deliberated for minutes. The verdict, guilty on all counts. Antoinette Frank now sits on Louisiana's death row, one of only 2 women awaiting execution in the state. Appeals have come and gone, but the sentence stands. Her case has become a symbol of a broken system of trust destroyed and of a police department still reckoning with its past. The Kim An restaurant eventually reopened in a new location. The surviving Vu family moved, seeking peace. But for many in New Orleans, the name Antoinette Frank remains a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest threat wears a badge. 24. Zakieya Latrice Avery. In January 2014, a quiet neighborhood in Germantown, Maryland became the center of a case that defied belief. Inside a modest townhouse, 2 children were found dead, 2 others critically wounded, and a young mother standing at the center of it all. Her name was Zakieya Latrice Avery. Zakieya was 28 years old and a mother of 4, and by most appearances she lived a quiet life. She had worked as a pharmacy technician and was known to be soft-spoken, even warm. But beneath the surface, something was unraveling, a descent that would lead to one of the most shocking crimes in Maryland's recent history. Authorities say Zakieya believed she was fighting a spiritual war. Alongside 21-year-old Monica Sanford, a friend she met through church, Zakieya formed a group they called the Demon Assassins. Their mission to root out evil spirits wherever they believed them, to reside even within Zakieya's own children. On the night of January 16th, neighbors noticed something strange, a child left alone in a parked car for nearly an hour. One neighbor called 911. Police responded, but by then, the women and children were back inside. No one answered the door. The moment passed. Hours later, tragedy struck. Zakieya and Monica reportedly became convinced that demonic spirits had entered the children. What followed was a horrifying attempt to perform an exorcism, an act that claimed the lives of 1-year-old Norrell Harris and his 2-year-old sister Ziana. Their older siblings, ages 5 and 8, were stabbed but survived. When police arrived the next morning, alerted by another neighbor who spotted a bloody knife in a car outside, they found a grisly scene. 2 children were dead in bed, wrapped in wet blankets. Their siblings were found injured but alive. Zakieya fled out the back door but was quickly apprehended. Both Avery and Sanford were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder. During questioning, the women claimed they believed they were saving the children's souls from possession. There were no signs of ritual paraphernalia, no candles, no symbols, only the chilling conviction that something evil had taken root. Zakieya had a history of psychiatric hospitalizations. Sanford, too, had reportedly attempted suicide in the past. A judge ordered both women to undergo mental health evaluations. They were transferred to a maximum security psychiatric facility pending trial. As of now, Zakieya Avery remains in custody, held without bond. Her case has not faded from public memory, not because of notoriety, but because of the questions it still raises. How do belief and delusion intertwine? When mental illness is compounded by spiritual conviction, where is the line between treatment and accountability? The surviving children have been placed in care and are continuing to recover. The family, especially the children's father, has remained largely private, still reeling from what unfolded behind closed doors. Sometimes the most disturbing crimes are not driven by malice, but by misguided belief. And when that belief collides with fragile mental health, the results can be both tragic and incomprehensible. 25. Renee Denise Bowman. In a quiet Maryland neighborhood in September 2008, a battered young girl leapt from a second-story window to escape her home. Her desperate act would expose a chilling truth hidden just beneath the surface, one that would haunt a community and ignite national outrage. The woman behind it all was Renee Denise Bowman. Born in 1965, she appeared outwardly ordinary, an adoptive mother of 3 children, raising them in what seemed to be a typical suburban household. But behind closed doors, Bowman harbored a dark secret. Authorities later uncovered that her home was not a sanctuary. It was a place of control, isolation, and torment. And in the basement freezer of that house in Lusby, Maryland, police found the frozen bodies of 2 little girls, Jasmine and Minette Bowman, ages 7 and 9. The horrors began years earlier when Bowman adopted the 3 girls through the District of Columbia's foster care system. She received more than $150,000 in subsidies intended to support the special needs children she had pledged to care for. But investigators say she was never motivated by love. Instead, they allege she was driven by control and money. Between 2006 and 2007, while living in Rockville, Bowman murdered Jasmine and Minette, suffocating them with a pillow. Their lifeless bodies were wrapped sealed in plastic and placed in a freezer she would transport from home to home as she relocated across Maryland. All the while, she continued collecting financial support for the 2 girls, pretending they were alive. For over a year, their younger sister, the only surviving child, endured unimaginable abuse. She was locked in a room with a reverse door lock, forced to use a bucket as a toilet, and beaten with a bat and shoes. She later testified in court, calmly and courageously referring to Bowman as her ex-mother. In her words, Bowman choked her so many times she couldn't keep track. It wasn't until the girls' daring escape that the full extent of the tragedy was uncovered. As detectives followed the trail from the freezer to Bowman's past homes, the truth unraveled. A former cellmate testified that Bowman confessed to smothering the girls. Forensic evidence, including Bowman's own recorded admissions, corroborated the timeline. When asked who wrapped the bodies, who placed them in bags, and who froze them, Bowman's reply to each was the same: "I did." In 2010, Renee Bowman was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole plus 75 additional years. She had previously received 25 years for the abuse of the surviving child. Today, she remains incarcerated, her crime serving as a stark reminder of the flaws in a system that failed 3 vulnerable children. The case forced a reevaluation of foster care oversight in Washington, D.C., and raised difficult questions about how such brutality could go undetected for so long. Perhaps the most haunting insight came not from the court or prosecutors, but from the surviving child herself, who, when asked why she called Bowman her ex-mother, simply answered, "I just don't like saying her name." Sometimes silence speaks louder than words.